Hello, everybody. Hope that you're doing well today. I'm joined today by a guest, Spencer Case, and we'll be having a long and interesting discussion, about what his work is and what he's been doing. Spencer, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and let people know how they can get in contact with you, or like how they can see your works and what you're working on.
Okay, I am a postdoctoral fellow at the Wuhan University School of Philosophy, and I'm speaking from Wuhan, China right now. And I usually describe myself as a writer. I do a lot of writing, and I'm working on a couple of philosophy books. And those seem to be the main things. You can see most of my work, popular and otherwise, displayed on my website, which is just spencercasephilosophy.com. I've also got the Micro Digressions podcast that I started last year, so I hope you get a chance to check that out. It's a philosophy podcast.
Okay. So as a postdoc, what does a postdoc in philosophy do?
Well, it depends on what kind of postdoc you've got. In my case, it's purely a research position. So what I do is I read and think and write and try to get publications.
Okay.
But in other cases, it'll more frequently be a teaching position as well. So you'll have some research responsibilities and some teaching responsibilities.
So I was a postdoc for a longer than average amount of time. It took me 9 years to transition from postdoctoralhood to faculty. It's pretty common to have teaching going along with some postdocs, especially like the National Science Foundation. They have some that are specifically geared towards that. What does philosophy research entail?
What does it entail?
Yeah, how does one go from an idea, like what kind of ideas do you generate, and then how does that work its way through the system to producing literature?
Yeah, well, if you're like other physicists, you'll think I'll describe it to you, and you'll think, oh, that's it. That's okay. So it's really hard to say, what is the beginning of this process, because usually when I sit down to write a paper, I realize it's been something I've been thinking about for a long time that's finally sort of coalescing. But I'll have some idea. I'll think of, a response to skepticism, a new response to skepticism, or a new response to some kind of moral skepticism. Typically would be the sort of thing I would do. And I think about it and, ask some friends, does this seem plausible to you? There's usually some reliance on intuition in philosophy. So sort of like, does it seem right to you that, such and such an act would be wrong, or such and such a belief in these conditions would be justified? And so you sort of introspect yourself and ask other people you respect whether they agree with you on those sorts of assessments. And they say, no, you're crazy. It's back to the drawing board. And then what? You think about it, you write it, you realize, oh no, there are all these objections. And, you try to hammer them out or narrow the scope of the paper so it doesn't have the same sorts of objections subject to it. Now, that probably doesn't sound to you like much of a methodology, but that's basically what we do.
To what degree do philosophy studies, to what degree are they quantitative? Do you ever look at how a particular philosophy how you might interpret some ongoing event or some societal, statistical property might correlate with a philosophical outlook?
That is typically the bailiwick of the social sciences. There's been some effort of philosophers to be more empirical. There's a movement called experimental philosophy, but it's really more like survey philosophy. It's just you're surveying people about what their intuitions are about various sorts of cases. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't really sound experimental to me. So I think the long and short of it is probably just no, we don't really do that kind of thing. I did do a little bit of graduate work where I was I briefly pursued a certificate in cognitive science, but I lost interest in it, because I found like empirical correlates of things are just not all that interesting. Like there was one talk I went to where they were trying to find like a neurocorrelate of resentment, and the experiment was something like they had pictures of these people's exes, and they would like scan their brains and then show them random pictures of people, and then an X would pop up, and then something would happen. These neurons would get all excited, and they're like, aha, there's a neurocorrelate for resentment. And my first thought was like, well, it could have been like sadness, it could have been happiness, it could have been anything. It's really hard to know. And even if you ask the person afterward, you might not get an exact read on that. And the other thing is, suppose we 100% for sure have found the neurocorrelate of resentment. Like, what does that tell us about the nature of resentment? That's interesting. Nothing as far as I can tell. So, yeah, it's pretty non-quantitative,
so,
I think.
In that regard, is it more fundamentally like a logic system where you have some kind of premise and then use the logic to pursue? Like, what are the outcomes, or what does that imply?
Yeah, it's more like that. It's more like that.
Okay, because in that regard, it would be a lot more like mathematics than it would be physics.
In some respect, it's difficult to classify. Actually, philosophy is rightly considered one of the humanities, but certainly over the 20th century, there's been a move to want to be more like science, and in some respects that's good. In some respects, I'm not sure. We should just respect that we're doing different things. But yeah. So how does it usually proceed? I mean, there's just this fundamental reliance on like a sense of what like a problem is. Like you sense a problem that it's difficult to see any kind of experiment that could conceivably resolve it. That is a good indication of like an interesting philosophical problem. So I'll give you one example. So if you're considering the relationship between God and God's commandments, you might ask, did God command these things because these are the right things to command, or are they right because he commanded them? That's called the Euthyphro dilemma, from the dialogue of Plato by that name. And that, you see, it's difficult to see what kind of empirical observations we could make that could resolve that kind of question. And yet, I would say, and most philosophers would say, that it seems like a meaningful question. And I would make the further...
So that would be a question of, does the authority dictate morality, or does the morality pre-exist?
Exactly.
And then the authority adheres to the pre-existing morality.
Exactly. Yes, that's exactly it.
So that's kind of similar to, isn't it the Platonic, or the Platonic shapes where there is a sphere regardless of the existence of a sphere? Like there's some, like, does the sphere exist if you don't? Yeah. Does the sphere exist if it hasn't been physically manifest?
Yeah, there's a similarity there. So a Platonist is going to say that there are these forms that exist, that there are universals that exist, and it's difficult to parse this out exactly, but I'll just be rough and say this, just apart from individual objects in some sense. So the Platonist with regard to morality, and I would describe myself as a kind of Platonist with regard to morality, would think there are just ethical principles that simply exist. And you could think that even God is beholden to those principles. Although that's controversial, some theists would say that compromises God's authority, and so you run into some theological problems with that. But that's one way to go. But it's the same sort of idea as like there's a mathematical form for a sphere, and that exists even if there is no actual sphere instantiated anywhere in the universe. Mathematical Platonism is still defended, by a lot of people. So what to say here? I happen to be thinking about this God and authority thing because I wrote a section in this book I'm writing on meta-ethics with my colleague, and I happen to have just written a section on divine command theory. So it's fresh on the brain.
Uh-huh. So, because this is one thing that comes up in physics even, where they have, like, the electron doesn't exist until you measure its presence, right? There's an electron field, and then it's the fluctuations of that electron field that will manifest as an electron, but it doesn't actually appear until you've made a measurement that forces it to come into existence. I will admit that I'm not up to speed or like up to date on my philosophical interpretations of quantum mechanics.
Oh wow, that's terrible.
So, but
how could you be behind on that?
I know it's rough, but there are, that's kind of the interpretation that is still canonically taught, even though the most widely taught interpretation of quantum mechanics isn't the one that's most widely accepted by the people who care about it. In that the canonical interpretation, the Copenhagen interpretation, basically says there's an electron field, but the electron itself doesn't exist until you measure its properties. So it doesn't actually it's not spinning in a particular direction until you make the measurement to determine the spin. And so it's one of those, there are a lot of philosophical debates about like, what does this actually mean in terms of quantum mechanics? And what can you know and what can't you know, and how does that manifest in, like, why do things still work, right? Why do cell phones still work if you don't know if the electron hasn't been measured, kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I know very, very little about this domain. It's way out of my bailiwick, but I do understand that with quantum mechanics, you're coming up to, the very limits, the very frontiers of human knowledge when you get down to that level. And it's when theorists start to wonder, like, what sort of long-standing principles that govern our thought are we willing to compromise in the interest of coming up with the best theory? And so when you think about questions like that, it's a way of, there's an on-ramp to philosophy there, right? There's an on-ramp to philosophical questions because you've got to consider ultimate principles of inquiry to even get a handle of what's going on here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the main challenges that quantum mechanics faces in terms of like what interpretation is correct in terms of what actually happens is that when it comes to what you measure in a laboratory, the different interpretations don't give different results. And so it's a challenge to come up with an experiment that would be able to distinguish between the metaphysics that's happening instead of just like, well, we made this measurement and this is the property we measured. How would you be able to tell if it was the many worlds hypothesis versus the Copenhagen interpretation? And so that's, in that regard, if you have like when you have one of these philosophical questions that comes up, how is there a way that you'd be able to tell, or like, what are the ramifications of it? Maybe that's a better way to put it. What are the ethical ramifications of, say, the difference between if moral pre-exists an authority or if the morality comes from the authority?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Now, with ethics, there's this further wrinkle of what would even count as an observation, right? What counts as an observation? What upshot would we even be looking for? Like, you at least have some idea of like what a difference in measurement would be in physics. But in philosophy, it's hard to say what the data even is, even because even that is going to be contested, right? So one sort of way is to just reflect on the upshots of the theory. So it's widely held to be a refutation of very strong forms of divine command theory that God could have commanded anything. So if you imagine the worst, morally the worst thing you can think of, whatever it is, don't tell me, I don't want to hear about it, but just keep in mind the worst thing you could even imagine. And then think, God could have made that right. And not only could God have made that right morally, there was no reason for him not to prior to his commanding his current command. Now, that strikes most people as an unacceptable result. You're hard-pressed to say very much about why it's unacceptable. You have to say something like, well, morality seems to be basic, or at least the fundamentals of morality don't seem like the sorts of things that can be contingent on someone's will in this way, even like a really, really powerful will. It just doesn't seem to be that kind of thing. You could also say, well, I have some sense that God is good, and it's difficult to make sense of the goodness of a God who could command things like that. And, how could he have been good prior to his issuing his commands if his commands set the very standard of goodness and rightness? So these are questions you could ask. And if they lead you to reject divine command theory, this is how you'd be reasoning. You would be taking certain assumptions. The assumption is that, let's say, the basics of morality are not contingent, right? Rape could not have been right. That could not be. You're taking that as an assumption. Mm-hmm. And then you're saying, okay, well, this theory has an implication that's unacceptable because it comes up against that assumption. So I'm going to reject the theory. But then, here's where things get tricky, because somebody could say, well, why don't we reject the assumption? And it is difficult to know what to say to somebody like that. It's always, and I think maybe this isn't totally unique to philosophy here, but I think it's always difficult to know how to respond to someone who rejects your fundamental assumption. And you can always imagine a skeptic who responds by rejecting whatever starting point that you proceed from. And so that's a whole other issue in philosophy is how does one respond to skepticism of that sort?
Mm-hmm. Is that so I'll admit that having not studied philosophy, that I only get what happens to come across in the media today. Is that basically what the postmodern school is questioning the assumptions that go into these kinds of things, or is that something separate?
I don't know what it is, so I think you.
Does anybody know what it is?
I don't know. Uh-huh. I probably shouldn't comment on it. I mean, I take it that when people criticize postmodernism, they're criticizing the sort of like overemphasis on social construction, skepticism of objectivity, skepticism of like there being one reality. Now, I don't know whether Derrida and these people actually question those things, because to be honest, I haven't gone back and read them. I do know that you can find people espousing these sorts of ideas at universities. I remember a few years ago, there was a literature PhD student I knew, and we were sitting in a coffee shop. We happened to be studying at the same coffee shop, and so he asked me about my research, and I said I was defending moral realism. I can tell you what that is in a minute, but it's roughly the idea there's an objective moral reality, and then he starts pushing back on the whole notion of objectivity, and I said, well, surely you accept objectivity, at least in the physical sense, right? Like the Earth orbits the sun, right? And I know actually that's not, you could cavil with that. You could say it's sort of framework dependent or something, I think. But in any event, that was my example of an objective physical fact. And he said, well, but if you observe it from an angle, it looks like a corkscrew. And I just thought, yeah, that's two different ways of describing exactly the same thing. Not a rejection of any kind of objectivity. So you see people adhering to these ideas that are called postmodern, but I would say, if you ask me, these blanket denunciations of postmodernism by like Jordan Peterson or whatever, it's better to just focus on particular ideas that are not part of huge bundles with huge histories of interpretation behind them. Like, let's consider the idea that morality is relative to culture. Now let's think about that. Now let's think of the idea that, I don't know, there is no determinable number of human sexes, or, let's just consider ideas one by one, and refrain from commenting on huge packages like this, unless we absolutely have to. But in the case of like the criticism of postmodernism, I don't know that we have to.
Yeah, so one of the things that you just mentioned, because I just gave my lecture today in my astronomy class was about Newton's laws of motion, and I mentioned, basically Newton's laws of motions are the way that you map the physical world into mathematics. So you observe some stuff, you have a point of reference, like you choose a reference frame, you choose an origin, you choose a velocity of your reference frame, and then you place the objects in that reference frame, and then you invoke these forces that cause the objects to change their motion relative to your reference frame. And it's basically, Newton's laws are essentially, how do you map what you observe and how you quantify, like how you place things in your world onto how they behave once they start interacting into the mathematics, so that then you can calculate where they will be in the future. So it's a mechanism of putting it into the math so that you can make a prediction, a quantitative prediction, and then extract it back out. And I pointed out that one of the most misunderstood, most often quoted, but most misunderstood laws is the third one, where every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And then, so, a lot of kind of armchair scientists who write scripts for movies and things like that tend to invoke that as, the governing principle behind a whole bunch of completely unrelated aspects of human behavior and stuff. But what I find most interesting as I continue to learn about physics in general, because I study it still, is what's really going on with in a lot of physics is that you're trying to identify what remains the same regardless of how you view it. So what quantity stays the same no matter, so for example, the speed of light. The speed of light is always the same regardless of how fast you're moving relative to anything else. Which actually is interesting, because that implies that the universe, rather than having a length scale that's fundamental, it has a velocity that's fundamental. Like the thing that you measure things with in the universe is actually a speed and not a distance. And no matter how you move, that unit of velocity stays fixed regardless of your reference frame, how fast you're moving relative to whatever it is that you happen to be observing. And a lot of science is basically coming up with what things remain unchanged regardless of how you transform your coordinate system. If you rotate your coordinate system, if you stretch it in some direction, what stays unchanged? And then the laws are built around, it's not so much the laws, you find that, and then it allows you to make transformations from one point of view to another, with the understanding that the underlying symmetry, or this underlying property, is invariant in those two different frameworks. You'll still get the same result even if you interpret the coordinates differently or something like that. So it's kind of a different, I guess fundamentally physics is about like, what do you find that's the same, so that then you don't have to worry about people's points of view, because regardless of how someone calculates it, it will be, they'll come up with the same result.
Right.
And I guess a similar thing was, if you're going to compose a message to alien species, the messages that were put on the spacecraft that are leaving the solar system, like the Voyager spacecraft and the Pioneer spacecraft, they put in their symbols that correspond to certain transitions in atomic spectra. Like this is 1 unit, and they show the hydrogen atom, and then when it flips over, that gives you 1 unit, and then they measure everything else in terms of that unit, so that this is something that everyone's going to interpret the same way once they thought about it a little bit. Anyone who's capable of identifying this spacecraft would know about this physics, because it's going to be invariant as you go through space. Is that so? Going back to what your work is, what specifically are the kinds of questions that you have historically been interested in and that bring you up to today?
Well, I hope we can come back to this whole question about objectivity.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we can do that now. We can
do that now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Stick with it.
So I was thinking, as I was hearing you describe that, I was thinking, I've not studied physics myself, and my exposure to these ideas often comes to me through, philosophers who want to interpret the world entirely through physics.
Mm-hmm.
Like sometimes they're called physicalists, sometimes they're called naturalists. But in a nutshell, I'm talking about the idea that what we can understand through the methods of the natural sciences is fundamental reality. And there is no fundamental reality above and beyond that, or more basic than that, or what have you. So basically, the world as revealed to us through physics is the world as it exists fundamentally. And I remember one discussion I had at a graduate school get together where they had the philosophy people and they had the physics people together. And I was speaking with me and this other grad student was speaking with this physics student who just assumed that was true, and just assumed that, like, he'd read Carl Sagan's book, The Demon Haunted World, and was just convinced that like science is like humanity's one tool for uncovering reality. And we kept pushing him on this. Well, does science ever claim to be metaphysics? Does science is it ever even proposed as being what you're claiming it to be, right? Like, how do you know that it is our only tool for uncovering reality, or the ultimate tool for uncovering reality? And he didn't really have an answer to that. And so I think actually there's a sense in which I wouldn't say philosophy and physics is in opposition, because I don't think that. I believe in the unity of knowledge. But there's a sense in which philosophers and physicists can find themselves in a kind of opposition, because I really think that philosophy is rooted in the first person perspective. I think philosophical problems, and to an extent philosophical methods, really proceed from the first person point of view. Whereas with physics, what you describe is something where you're trying to abstract from the first person point of view to something that is objective. And I think what some philosophers have said.
So by objective, in this case, do you mean objective meaning that it's something that will be, like what I mentioned, some quantity that will be the same regardless of who views it? Or there's some effective way of transforming from one person's perspective to another that keeps it the same. Like, it's something that they have to agree upon.
Now, I guess the word for that would be probably invariant would be a better word for that than objective. But I was thinking more of information that did not make any reference to a particular point of view.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
That's kind of what I was thinking. And so here's an interesting question. The universe contains beings like you and me, and we have particular points of view. We have consciousness. We have, I think, a sense of right and wrong. And if the way of investigation is to abstract away from the first person point of view to a description of the world that doesn't make reference to particular viewpoints, are you not leaving something out of the picture? And there are a couple of books that I've read that press this point of view in philosophy. The first one
can you say your last sentence one more time? Just I want to make sure I understand.
Oh, what was my last sentence?
So you have these different consciousness, different people have their different points of view, and how does that get you back to the objective? What does that imply for?
Yeah, so the ultimate, if you have your theory of everything, if you were to happen on your physics grand theory would that theory make reference to particular points of view, or would it describe the world at a level of objectivity where, you're talking about quarks, you're talking about cosmic forces of various sorts, that, how different particles combine, but like our points of view, our beings with points of view, like a fundamental part of this. Or is that something that gets left behind just by the very method of trying to step away from the particularity, just as your general method? Like, this is a question Thomas Nagel raises in The View from Nowhere, and there's another book. I'm forgetting the author's name. It's Philip something or other. Philip Goff, I think. Yeah, Philip Goff has a book called Galileo's Error, where he argues for panpsychism. So the idea that there's like a mental aspect to everything, as a way of solving the mind-body problem. Like what explains the relationship between the body and the mind? And he argues that the scientific method itself, as set out by Galileo, where you're just trying to get a description of quantities and like bodies and masses. You try to describe things at that level, and you're abstracting from things. You're inevitably leaving things behind. And that's not a bad thing. Like, science is, according to Goff, effective because it doesn't try to give it like a totalistic description of everything. It says, let's just talk about masses and quantities and things like that, and then you can get a lot farther when you do that. But his thought is, but we should remember that there was that initial decision to abstract from the subjective viewpoint. And how should we combine like the fact of subjective viewpoints, the fact of consciousness, with this materialist view of the universe? We're going to need to go back and think about that step, and to some extent question whether like scientific methods are giving us the whole of reality out of it.
Yeah, so let me complicate it a little bit further. Your connection is kind of going in and out, but it still seems to be stable, but it did blur there for a second. So just for the people who are watching, we may get disconnected, and we'll try to reconnect if that happens. So let me complicate the situation a little bit further. So have you read Gödel, Escher, Bach?
No, I've not.
Okay. So it basically goes into some of the implications of Gödel's theorem. So Gödel's theorem it's a mathematical theorem. So it's something that basically you have a premise and then you follow the logic, and the logic leads you to this contradiction, which is basically that if you have a system, like a mathematical system that's sufficiently sophisticated, that you can coin phrases or you can make statements in that system that can neither be proven true nor false. And so an example would be in the English language, which is, there's a mathematical, you can imagine deriving a mathematical formalism for producing English language sentences. You can produce sentences like, this sentence is false. That's something that's neither true nor false. It's, if the sentence itself is true, then it must be false because that's what it says. And if the sentence is false, then it must be true because that's what the sentence says. And so there's a limit to what you can actually explore, or what you can actually, explore, I think is a good way to say it. There's a limit to what you can prove in any mathematical system of any useful complexity. And as a consequence, when it comes to like science, I think that because the scientific method is itself, you can imagine it being a mathematical formalism in terms of like you make a prediction and you can write the steps down in some kind of prescriptive way for evaluating the truthfulness of something. And that implies that the limits of science are limited by what you can demonstrate mathematically. And we already know that any really complex mathematical structure is going to have things that you can neither prove nor disprove. And so as a consequence, the scientific method is limited by what, it's going to have its limits. It's going to discover those truths that are amenable to discovery through the scientific method, through the application of the scientific method, which need not be everything. Maybe it's everything that you might call physical, in that if you can't measure it, then you wouldn't consider it physical, which I'm fine. I don't have a problem with that. So science basically is a way of discovering all the truths that can be discovered through the scientific method, or some approximation to the scientific method, where if there is some truth that exists that cannot be discovered through that mechanism, it doesn't mean that truth itself doesn't exist either.
Now, I have to say, you cut out, my connection wavered while you were, the first part of your explaining Gödel's theorem, but I think I got the main upshot of what you're saying there. I guess I'm curious, though, is it true that science uses mathematics, but it seems like it also uses a lot of imagination and things like that. So it isn't like we're just working out axioms, or something like that, right? Like we can use different mathematical models, and you can develop new mathematical tools. So I'm not sure why it would have to be constrained in the way that you're describing.
It's constrained because in order for something to be scientific, it has to be, one, it has to be falsifiable. So you have to be able to create a test where you would make a measurement and determine how well the measurement matches the prediction that you make. And it could be that, maybe you do it backwards, where you make a measurement, you're like, wow, what's this? And then you derive a theory that comes up with that prediction. But ultimately, you would need to be able to test the model with, physical instruments so you can develop new mathematical tools, but those are all still tools that are with the express objective of identifying certain properties that you can measure in a laboratory with physical instruments. Or you could measure by looking out in space and, seeing the consequences of that prediction as in a collection of galaxies or whatever the case may be. And so science is always limited, and the limitation isn't a bad thing, right? A kite is limited as well, but if you cut the string, then the kite is no longer flying. So the constraint that is placed on science is that there has to be some mechanism to make measurements that either agree with or disagree with the predictions. That's like at the interface between experimental and theoretical science. And so a lot of stuff that's going on, I think right now, honestly, in the science that's really popular, string theory and things like that, they may be true, but there's a reasonable chance that we'll never be able to measure any of the predictions that they make because the energies are just too high. And so in the absence of having a fundamental prediction that could be measured, then to some extent it's outside the realm of science. It's not science anymore. It might be an extrapolation. We're going to take these mathematical tools and we're going to extrapolate them beyond the realm of science and into, what would happen in some hypothetical situation, which is, that's kind of what Einstein did too. He's like, what would happen if I was in a train that went faster than the speed of light, or as fast as the speed of light? That's
the point I was going to make. And I would say, who cares whether it's science? Is it knowledge? That's the question I think we should care about. But I was going to make the point that if you look at the history of science, there is a pretty significant role for thought experiments. I think you probably know that, with Galileo refuting Aristotle's account of motion, I guess gravity. I don't even know if that's I think that was the appropriate word for it. Why objects fall. His account of how objects fall to the earth. Mm-hmm. The legend is that he dropped 2 balls from the top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. In fact, he had a thought experiment where you had a heavier object and a lighter object that were tied together with a string. Do you know this one?
Yeah, and then the question is, so if the heavier object falls faster, then what happens if you tie the lighter object to it? Does it fall even more faster?
Yeah. Or does it? Yeah. Does it drag it, or does it go even more faster? And it seems like you could predict both things with Aristotle's theory. Something's got to be wrong with that theory. But that's not an observation, right? That's a thought experiment. And that's one that actually I think, demonstrates a contradiction. And then you had, the Schrodinger's cat experiment. To go back to quantum mechanics, I think I'm going to end up saying absolutely everything I know about quantum mechanics in this interview, which is very little. But I think this was just a counterexample to the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, where if I think didn't it have the implication that a single electron would have to both have and not have some property?
Yeah, it's basically like the cat. The premise was you have some radioactive thing that has a 50% chance of decaying in some period of time, and so the question is, and when it decays, a gun will fire and kill the cat. And so when that time has elapsed, is the cat simultaneously alive and dead?
Yeah, it seems like we don't actually need to build this contraption and put a cat in it to come to some conclusions here. Like, you think about it and you're like, oh, like a cat can't be both alive and dead. Okay, so the theory can't be right. So I'm wondering why we can't proceed, even if we were at the limits of what we can establish experimentally, we could still come up with more thought experiments like this. And if somebody says, well, that's not science, you could say, A, neither was what we've been doing up until now, if you take that standard, and B, who cares what's science? This whole demarcation problem, where does science end and where does non-science begin? I think that's a whole lot of hoopla over nothing.
Yeah, I'll agree. I'll agree with that. That there's a fluffy gray area separating the two. Like there's these distributions that will overlap when you transition from like science that's like what would be accepted in the Large Hadron Collider as a scientific result, versus when you get to the extremes like the multiverse and stuff like that. Where there's no way to empirically demonstrate the presence of a multiverse. Well, okay, so that's not entirely true either. But your options are a lot more limited and ultimately become completely limited in some regards when you get out to the extreme fringes of it. And so, I accept the fact that there isn't a hard boundary between, when you like all of a sudden leave the realm of science and enter into something else.
But right, when people say, well, that's not science, at least when a physicist is saying it to another physicist, I imagine that's intended as a kind of criticism.
So I guess when I would say it's probably true that, so a friend of mine, he described some of the stuff that's going on as like the theory of everything. He would call it like the theory of everything not accessible in laboratories, or toenail. And, just as a kind of a pejorative, that this stuff is so far out of the realm of what we can actually imagine measuring that he wonders if it's worth their pursuing those lines of questioning. So what I would say is the fact that something is not measurable, I don't know that it necessarily makes it less valuable to think about it. And what I would, if I were to tell someone, at some point it's no longer really science, what I would mean by that is not necessarily that what you're doing is a complete waste of time, but rather don't put too much stock in the conclusions that you're drawing. And like I'll give you an example. In physics, the Planck length is this highly revered quantity that, if you take the fundamental constants and then you put them all together in this fashion, then you get the Planck length. And this is the magical length where once you get down to the Planck length, then that's when all the magic happens. You have this quantum fluffiness and things like that, or the quantum foam. And my response to that has usually been, I wouldn't put quite so much faith in the Planck length as being, this magical quantity that the universe has chosen. But rather, what that really tells you is that there needs to be some physics that's yet undiscovered, meaning some physical phenomena that's yet undiscovered that happens before you get to that length scale. Before you, as you get to observe things on smaller and smaller scales, some new physics needs to be discovered before you arrive at the Planck length. That's really all it means. It doesn't mean that the Planck length is this quantity that's chosen by some omnipresent person, that, okay, this is the idol from Indiana Jones. Like, this is the most important thing that exists. Rather, it's a benchmark that that by the time you get to that benchmark, something else has to come up. Because if you arrive at that benchmark with your current understanding of the universe, then things break all of a sudden. And so that often, when I've been involved in these kinds of conversations with people, that would be my cautionary tale, is I don't put too much stock in the Planck length. You get it from, you take these physical constants that we measure at our low energy universe, where the ambient temperature is 100 Kelvin. You can't necessarily extrapolate those constants 20 orders of magnitude and really have a lot of confidence that everything is the way that you think it is.
So I'm not sure I got all of that, but one thing I thought I heard you saying is, or an implication of what I thought I heard you saying, is that you take the Planck length to be epistemic rather than metaphysical, meaning that it is a useful thing to consider when we're considering the limits of our theories and what we know, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it plays this foundational role in the nature of reality. Yeah,
basically. So can you explain to me what epistemic? I hear people use this word all the time and I have no idea what it really means.
It just means relating to knowledge. That's all it means.
Okay. So you said an epistemic versus a what?
Metaphysical.
Metaphysical. So a metaphysical thing is like, is that like a fundamental property?
You could think of it that way. So metaphysics, also ontology, those words are basically synonyms. I think they're totally synonyms. Maybe some people stipulate a difference, but they both describe like fundamental existence. They're both areas of philosophy where we're talking about what the fundamental relations and properties are. Mm-hmm. So that's what that is. And then epistemology is a branch of philosophy that explores knowledge, and it's actually much more recent as a branch of philosophy, like as it considered like its own little branch of philosophy than a lot of people realize. Used to be that you had your theory of mind and you had your theory of the world, and then when you had the two together, you'd have an account of how the mind apprehends the world, and so you didn't need any distinct area of epistemology. But over the last few hundred years, it's sort of become a sort of its own sub area of philosophy. Mm-hmm.
So let me switch gears a little bit. One of the things that I have a graduate student who has got a master's in philosophy and then came here to study physics, and I brought this up with him at one point, but we haven't had the opportunity to really flesh it out. But one of the things is, in science, like in quantum mechanics, the way that quantum mechanics is currently formulated, the way that we can measure how something is going to move, like how a particle is going to move from one place to another, the assumption that we make now, the fundamental assumption, let's assume that this is true, and then let's see what the consequences of that are. And the assumption that we make that is true is that all possible trajectories are equally likely. So you have an electron that's going to move from one place to another. It needs to be at this place at one time and at this place at another time, with some velocity associated with it at each point in time. And then you say, what path does it take to get there? In the presence of the gravitational field and maybe an electromagnetic field, you have this environment that it's moving in. And the fundamental assumption is that all paths that you take are equally likely. And how do you know what we actually observe? How does what we actually observe correlate with all of the fact that it can go from here over to the Andromeda galaxy and back on the other side? And the answer to that is that along each of these paths, the particle has kind of a clock that goes with it. And you add how that clock advances. So it's advancing along all these different paths.
Now, I'm sorry. Could you back up? What kind of an energy exchange would this be? When would this electron make this movement?
Like as an example, suppose you have a bowling ball. You can do it with a bowling ball. You take a bowling ball, you throw it up in the air, and it comes back down, and it follows some parabola.
Uh-huh.
And how do we know that it really follows that parabola? Well, so we observe it following that parabola. But the quantum mechanical description of that is that not only does it follow that parabola, but it follows every other possible path that you could imagine. It goes from this point to this point, and it simultaneously follows all of those paths and then comes to the other side. And
the bowling ball does.
Yeah, the bowling ball does. And so the question is then, why do we see the bowling ball move along the parabolic path?
Wait. Are you telling me, because I thought we were talking about like little tiny particles do this, but macro objects like a bowling ball follow multiple paths, even though we only observe like a parabola?
Yeah, basically.
Okay.
So because what's the difference between a proton and a bowling ball? The only difference is what's its quantum wavelength.
The protons in the textbooks that I saw were usually green.
Okay, so that's the only difference. You have
Just kidding.
You have a green bowling ball. So the difference is that, okay, so then what you do is as it follows all these different trajectories, it's as though it's a wave function. So it's wiggling as it goes. And some paths, when the waves combine, when the paths combine, they combine in a destructive manner. So that it's like noise canceling headphones, where when the wave is moving in a particular direction, the path of an adjacent path will be moving in the opposite direction. And ultimately those two paths cancel each other out because you sum them together. And so like the clocks are it's not really a clock, it's a phase of the wave function. So the phase of the wave function is advancing as it's moving along these different paths, but the paths decohere because they get out of phase with each other. And when you add two waves that are out of phase with each other, they cancel each other, and so you don't see them. And it's only those paths where, as the particle moves along these adjacent paths, where they don't decohere and where they actually remain in phase. And those are the ones that you actually observe. So you're actually, when the ball moves from follows some trajectory from one place to another, it does go through all possible paths, but only the paths that follow only the paths where all along the path, these wave functions move in the same fashion. So they're not competing against each other, but they actually add together. Only along that path will you actually see the ball as it moves. So what's happening, the way that you would describe it is you'd say the phase that's advancing is the action. It's the Lagrangian, which is an equation that encapsulates the energy that the particle has. And then you follow that energy as it moves, and that's what advances the wave, advances the wiggling of the wave. And when the action is at a minimum, so you have when you evaluate how much action does each path take, like how much of this quantity does each path advance. And when you're at the minimum, all of the paths have basically the same quantity, because as you shift slightly from one side to the other, they don't move in the vertical direction. But if you're away from that minimum, then a small change in the path length corresponds to a fairly large change in the action, and that's where the system decoheres. And so they deconstructively interfere with each other when you're away from the minimum, and they constructively interfere with each other when you're at the minimum. And so the path that minimizes the action is the path that you actually observe.
Okay. I don't know that I'm quite following here, because don't you want to say that the ones that cancel out are potential paths? Because if the bowling ball was actually traveling in all of those paths, wouldn't it need to split apart? Wouldn't it knock something over? I mean, I don't quite follow here.
It's so the separation between, like, how different can the paths be from each other? that's really what it comes down to, is how different can those paths be? What is the length scale that determines when one path is significantly different than another? And that length scale is Planck's constant. So it's a very, very tiny difference that will turn the very, very tiny difference of this quantity as you go from one point to another that will completely decohere adjacent paths. And as a consequence, when you have a bowling ball that has a gigantic mass, then the tiniest deviation from the actual prediction is basically eliminated to, infinity decimal places. And so the fact that the bowling ball has a large mass, when you compare it to a proton, the proton has a very small mass. And as a consequence, it can have paths that deviate slightly more from the traditional, like Newton would calculate path, the trajectory that Newton would calculate, because it's small compared to Planck's constant. But a bowling ball is gigantic compared to Planck's constant, right? It's 10 to the 23 protons compared to Planck's constant. And so now when you're talking about a small deviation in the path, it's 23 decimal places away in some exponential function. And so the probability becomes infinitesimally small when you deviate from what we actually observe.
Interesting.
And so I've been trying to corner this graduate student, but I need him to write a paper for me, so I haven't cornered him on this yet. But the idea there is, it actually kind of is a demonstration that because all possible paths are equally likely, it's just that some paths interfere with each other and other ones don't. And you observe the ones where all of them agree on this is the actual trajectory that you get. To me, it uses kind of similar ideas to the idea that you can't always have, maybe all possible interpretations. Maybe there is a way to interpret what you observe or, what someone perceives in a variety of different ways. However, the one that is most useful is the one where more people will agree, like more of these adjacent interpretations will actually agree on what happened.
Interesting. So, there's this the idea that ultimate truth is where all rational inquirers will converge at the end of inquiry or something like that.
Yeah.
C.S. Peirce had an account of, I guess it's unclear whether it's an account of truth per se or just an account of inquiry that says that the truth is what all rational inquirers, given an infinite amount of time and an infinite amount of resources to investigate, will eventually converge on this picture of reality, and that will be the true picture of reality.
Mm-hmm. So, anyways, that was something that I've been meaning to bat around with people, but I hadn't really thought about it until about a year ago, and something happened about a year ago. I can't remember what it was that made it so that a lot of close human contact stopped being the norm. But maybe once we're able to get back in the same room at the same time with people, I'll pick it back up again. But that was something that I've been thinking about. The same thing is kind of true with how people perceive things. If someone has, if you force, for example, like what does it mean when someone tries to stretch something to match their preconceived worldview? Like I'm going to assume that everybody's position on something is dictated by how much they like green Jell-O. Then, if someone doesn't like a particular, like I prefer dogs over cats, and someone's like, well, the reason you prefer dogs is because you actually don't like green Jell-O, and then they have to come up with some explanation for why your thoughts about dogs is correlated with something that may or may not actually be related. Is kind of basically saying, I'm going to filter everything that I observe through this one variable, and anything that I see is going to be somehow mapped onto this one possible line, like this one variable that I'm going to choose. And sometimes it seems to me that people are limited in how they perceive the world because they only interpret the world through a small subset of possibilities. So for example, it comes up fairly often where, the only thing that people care about is power, and using their power to, impose their will on other people. And every relationship is some kind of power dynamic, which means that would imply that you can't do it because of loyalty. Your actions can't be motivated by loyalty. They can't be motivated by love. They can't be motivated by hate. They can only be motivated by power, which would lead you along a path where you would say, well, I'm going to interpret everything as some kind of power dynamic. And then you kind of you can have kind of absurd conclusions where someone's motivations could be almost completely orthogonal or completely perpendicular to the desire for power. No, I agree with you about this as an example of an overly narrow interpretation. And this is one of the ideas that is associated with postmodernism. I don't know if Foucault is actually like this. Don't know. I'm probably not going to read him, to be honest. But people who are fans of Foucault do tend to say stuff like this. And it seems to me that one of two things has got to be going on. Either you're taking the notion of power and stretching it to such a degree that it's basically vacuous. It doesn't tell you much of anything, because everything counts as some form of power. So that the claim that everything is a power dynamic turns out to be a trivial statement and not some penetrating observation about human affairs. Doesn't give you the insight.
Or else you're just saying something that's plainly false, right? You see this too, although it's not as prominent, but you still find people who think this with like egoism, the idea that everyone is really motivated by self-interest. And again, people who take that kind of psychological egoism, you've either got to stretch the notion of self-interest so that it can explain apparently altruistic actions, or else they just got to say something that is contradicted by what we observe.
So let me bring it back to, maybe I can give a better analogy than the green jello and dogs and cats one. It would be as though I'm only going to interpret people's motions as they're either moving north or they're moving south. And so if someone goes from Los Angeles to New York, I would say they went north. If you have more than one direction that you can make, that you can infer motivations in more than one direction, then you say, oh, they actually moved east, which is not really north or south. It's a different direction. In that case, there is some correlation between the fact that they did actually move north a little bit, but the degree to which they move north, so it's a stretch to say when someone going from Los Angeles to New York went north. And at some point the stretch becomes absurd. Where you'd say someone going from, say, Hawaii to Florida went north, because Hawaii is at some latitude and Florida is at a slightly different latitude that's almost identical. And they're like, well, they went north. And there is some north to what they did, but the overwhelming majority of the trajectory that they took is east to west, which is not north.
What would the analogy be in terms of people's opinions? What would be the analog to that?
People's opinions on... So that would be like... The only reason that you buy flowers for your wife is because you want to have power over her.
Yeah, sure. And there may be some tiny grain of truth to that, but it would be a very unidimensional way of understanding all human interactions to think of it that way.
Or the only reason that I would say hello to someone on the street is because I want to have power over them. Something like that. I can't.
Not very plausible.
Yeah, I can't possibly want to just be someone who makes other people feel like they had a better day than they would have had I not been in it.
This strikes me as being like a conspiracy theory in a certain way, right?
Also,
like if you subscribe to some vast conspiracy theory, QAnon or what have you, then it gives you the kind of satisfaction of that you can see through the illusion that everybody else is sort of fooled by, right?
Uh-huh.
You know about the powers that are pulling the strings, or think you do anyway. So, and similarly, if you think that all relationships are reducible to power, that gives you a sense of power, doesn't it?
Right. So therefore, because I can take any interaction and interpret it in that regard, like along that axis, I can come up with some interpretation. It doesn't matter how absurd my interpretation is. The fact that I could come up with the interpretation is a demonstration that was the underlying motivation, as opposed to a demonstration that there could be some component in that direction.
Yeah.
In the absence, but the dot product need not be large, I guess, is the way that a physicist would put it. The angle between them could be 90 degrees or like 89 degrees, but there's still that 1 degree that's along the same direction, and as a consequence, therefore my interpretation must be correct. Regardless of how much I have to stretch it to.
It's also a totally unfalsifiable social theory, right? Like what could you possibly give to somebody who thinks that human beings are only motivated by self-interest, or that human beings are only motivated by power, that would disabuse them of this? Like, what could we conceivably observe that they would not be able to seamlessly incorporate into their vast social theory? Like, oh, look, here's an example. There's somebody named Matt Wage who left philosophy to become rich on Wall Street, to give all of that money to charity because he thought that was the right thing to do. Now, that sure looks like an altruistically motivated set of behaviors to me.
Mm-hmm.
And the person says, oh, but really he wants to feel good about himself. And it's like, okay. So is there any conceivable human behavior that would be evidence against your interpretation? If not, you've got an unfalsifiable theory, and that's a reason to be suspicious of it.
Yeah, well, exactly, right? At that point, it's no longer... Well, and so the scientist, if you have an unfalsifiable theory, would say, well, it's no longer scientific. You can't prove it wrong. There's no way to test it. There's no way to come up with...
Yeah. Who cares whether it's scientific or not? It's not justified. I think that's the main thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah, well, so, I mean, just like stepping outside of philosophy and going to science, if someone were to propose a theory that you cannot falsify no matter what you did,
sure.
At that point, then it's like, okay, enjoy your discussions.
Right.
But it's no longer something where the government, for example, or a group of people is going to invest millions or billions of dollars into it, because there's no way to advance, expand the frontiers of human knowledge if you're not actually interfacing with human knowledge, or if you're no longer interfacing with the methods that we learn things.
Right.
And so maybe the same thing would happen here, where if you have a unimodal or unidirectional worldview, then uniaxis worldview, then you can only explore things along that line, and the world is more complicated than that. The world is higher dimensional than a single parameter, and so as a consequence, if you're only expanding in one dimension when you have a presumably much larger dimensional space that people, that real people actually maneuver within, then you're not really advancing the frontier anywhere, because it's a higher, a line is infinitesimally small compared to a plane, and so if you're only advancing along the line, you're not actually exploring the plane.
Sure. Yeah, that's right. I wanted to go back to something you said earlier, though, because I was asking about. So, suppose you've got some theoretical advance that's based on thought experiments or something that isn't based on experimentation or empirical observation, and that might get the retort that, well, that's not science. And I said, well, is that supposed to be dismissive? Because I think it is. I think when we say something is science, usually people mean to say something evaluative about it, right? This sort of came up in my podcast with Philip LeBlanc on the limits of scientific authority, where he takes the view that we need to definitely define science in such a way that it's non-evaluative, so that there can be bad science, right?
What is bad science? What does he mean by that?
Science that's not done rigorously, science that's not done by appropriate methods, bad statistical methods, bad sampling, this kind of stuff. Like, that's bad science. But yeah, both of us sort of share the view that when you have the term pseudoscience, you're sort of suggesting that science is a success term. So that makes science this kind of authority that can never be questioned, because if you point to an instance of science where, like, oh, look, this person had a selective sample size or a selective sampling that biased the results of the study, and someone says, oh, well, then that just shows it isn't really science, then it seems like science by definition is just whatever's going to get it right. And it turns out to have the success like built into it conceptually, where I think that's not very useful.
Yeah, I don't know that I would subscribe to a statement that, well, I mean, like, take the Pons and Fleischmann result from the 1980s, the cold fusion result. So they employed bad scientific practices and got a result that was wrong. And nevertheless, it's not that what they did, wasn't science or like science-y. Like, the science is no longer a descriptive label, because what ended up happening was people came in and they said, oh, here's where your method was wrong. And if you redid your results using this other measurement technique, basically what had happened, as I understand it, I'm pretty confident this is what happened, is that they were basically making a measurement of something, and when they saw a signal that they were looking for, that's when they stopped taking the data. So they were not taking data on a random sampling of times, rather they were taking data until they saw a signal, and then they would stop taking the data, and then now their data has a signal in it. And so there are noise fluctuations that go both above and below, whatever they were measuring. And so they basically discounted the downward fluctuations and only counted the upward fluctuations, which, people do that, right? People always look for when one particular political party does something that I don't like, then I measure it. But when my political party does something that is basically the same, the mirror image of it, I ignore that. It's basically the same. Yeah,
confirmation bias. Right. Confirmation bias.
And so that's essentially what went into these measurements. And after it was done, people tried to reproduce it, and then they started investigating into the methods, and like, oh, here's where your methods kind of failed to produce the kind of sample that would give you the actual physical result. So, I mean, there's you're going to have lots of mistakes like that, I think, in general.
But it's still science, right?
So I would say yes, that, it's science because we're human and we're going to make mistakes. And ultimately the literature, the scientific literature, I view it as a dialogue more than a museum, where, you produce a result and, you look for, I still have a result that I have that I can't explain. And I'm still trying to find people who can poke a hole in it and say, like, why is this here? Why should this not be here? It's a signal. When you look at extrasolar planetary systems, there's a particular ratio of orbital periods that keeps showing up. And right now, there's no reason that orbital period should show up. It's just a statistically significant overabundance of planets with that separation. And I'm happy to be wrong. Maybe I did something wrong. Maybe the sample that we did it from is somehow biased, like it's just an anomaly that we missed. But it's still there. And so the literature, at least the literature that's consumed by scientists, like people who are active in the field, is a lot of conversation. Oh, this person did a study, they overlooked this effect, and so now we're going to incorporate that effect. And so there's kind of incremental motion in all directions where they'll either make corrections or they'll demonstrate, here's where someone's assumption is flawed. Like, this assumption no longer applies when some other situation happens. And so, or like they just did the wrong statistical analysis. Like a good example of someone doing is, so it was about 10 years ago, there was the discovery of evidence for inflation. And they'd measured this quantity from the B modes of the cosmic microwave background radiation. and everyone was super excited about it. And then they published the paper, and it's like, wow, inflation's been discovered, the graviton, we've seen the signatures of the graviton.
You mean inflation of the universe expanding.
Right, yeah, so early universe stuff. This was probably 2008, 2010, something like that. It must have been 2010 when this happened. And so everyone, oh, wow, this was a big deal. And then within a week, someone had redone the analysis incorporating the effect of dust in the galaxy. And we're like, when you correlate it with the dust in the galaxy, it disappears.
Oh, no.
And, you know, at the same time, like around the same time was the faster than light neutrinos. And so the scientist that is humble, and so this is like with the faster than light neutrinos, they basically were like, we see this measurement, we can't explain it, we're putting it out there so that other people can, you know, the community can take a look at it and maybe find a flaw in what we've done. And of course the media ran with it, it's like, oh, faster than light neutrinos, Einstein was wrong.
Right. That's how the media would do it.
Right. But then what actually happened was it went out and other people started looking at it and say, well, did you check this? Did you look at this? And did you examine? And it turns out that it was a cable that wasn't plugged in. It wasn't secured in how it was plugged in. And so it was giving a bad signal. And this is an experiment that has like thousands of cables. So it's easy you can imagine having one of them overlooked at some point. But, you know, it was the pursuit was still to try to identify, like, did we do something wrong, or can someone else reproduce this and kind of add credence to our discovery. You know, if someone else can if someone else can reproduce the result, then it adds credence that we did it right and that that there's something to what we found.
I would definitely make the distinction between what is flawed but done in good faith and what is, you know, deliberately manipulative. I think that is significant. And I'd say it's a good thing that you're at least occasionally encountering results that you can't immediately explain. Because if you could immediately explain every single thing that came up that you ever encountered, you'd have to begin to wonder whether or not you're like the person who thinks that all human social relationships are power relationships. You've got a paradigm, and everything just fits.
It all gets filtered through the same paradigm, so you can't see any other polarizations.
That's right. Like you can only get surprising results, and this is true of philosophy too. Hearing an argument that you're like, not sure exactly what to say about that. That can only happen if you're doing at least something right. Mm-hmm. Because if you're a zealot for a certain perspective, that problem will never arise. You'll
always be able to put it onto your, map it onto your allowed set of explanations.
Yeah, you'll just keep pounding the square pegs into the round holes, and so that's at least one good thing to remind yourself of when that happens, I guess.
So let's shift gears for a second, and I'm curious to know about your plans for this new work, your new oeuvre that's coming out.
Oh boy!
Or you're thinking of?
Won't be out for a while. So, 2 books I'm working on currently, both of which I've got advanced contracts with Routledge. So one of them is a book with my colleague Matt Lutz, which is debating moral realism and describing the whole subfield of metaethics, which is the area of philosophy that deals with the most abstract sorts of ethical questions. So we're no longer dealing about is abortion wrong? Is it right? Is it permissible? That kind of question. We're dealing with what is the nature of rightness and what does moral language actually do? Does moral language attempt to describe the world, or does it project the feelings of the or express the feelings of the person speaking, or what does moral language do? Can we make sense of there being moral properties? If there are moral properties, do they depend on human perspectives? Questions like this. So I take the position which is known as moral realism, which is that moral language does attempt to describe reality. some moral statements get it right. The truth makers, the things that determine whether or not moral statements are true, are not dependent on human perspectives or social construction. So there are objective moral truths. So that's my perspective.
Now, are you taking that perspective because it's what you think, or are you taking that perspective because you're going to advocate for that position?
Well, both. I'm going to advocate for what I think. Yeah.
Okay.
And so I'm going to write a constructive essay. My colleague, Matt Lutz, is going to write a constructive essay arguing for his position. So he's an error theorist, or basically a moral nihilist. He thinks that he agrees with me that moral language attempts to describe reality, but he thinks that it doesn't do so successfully because it attempts to attribute properties that don't exist. So he's an error theorist, and he's also a skeptic, meaning he thinks that even if there were these moral properties, we wouldn't be able to know about them. So we're going to write essays and then respond to each other in this book, and I'm really excited about that. So that's the first project I'm working on. Okay,
and are you able to talk about the other one that you're working on?
Yeah, the other one, it's really early days, but the other one is a book called Why It's Okay to Be Patriotic. It's part of the Why It's Okay series, which takes some sort of like maligned idea or practice and then sort of defends it. So there's like one called Why It's Okay to Want to Be Rich, Why It's Okay to Speak Your Mind, this kind of stuff. And so I just got the proposal approved, and I'm mostly just doing the research on this, on patriotism and nationalism and the limits of cosmopolitanism. So it's early days for that one, but that should be coming out in 2024.
So what is there a distinction between patriotism and nationalism that you're going to, like, are when you're writing this, are those going to be two different words, or are they going to be the same word?
Oh, man. Even with the little sort of preliminary investigation I've done, I've noticed that this distinction is going to be a real pain in the neck, because in some people's writings, there's synonyms. And then in other writings, they are, people are drawing distinctions between the two. And it's not like there's one standard one. There are like 8 different ones or something. And so
like it's almost like you'll have to have a glossary.
Yeah, no, it's going to be a real headache to sort this out. One way to sort out the difference, there's a sort of a normative distinction. So George Orwell defines patriotism as like a kind of virtue, and then nationalism is the vice. Nationalism is like aggressive, and it's the thing we associate with wars of aggression and that sort of thing. And patriotism is sort of milder, it's sort of defensive, it's sort of more like familiarity to one's own country. And so that's one distinction to draw. But if you draw that distinction, then patriotism turns out to be good by definition, because you defined it as a virtue. Yeah, okay. So
maybe there's this axis of like, well, yeah.
Besides knowing that, okay, whatever happens with the terminology, we can be sure that there is a defective version of love for country that just as
My Country, Right or Wrong, right? That's the song from Midnight Oil.
Yeah, but the thing is so that saying goes back to some colonel in like 1820, I forget who, but that I think is really not all that clarifying, because nobody actually thinks my country right or wrong. They just think their country's always right. And so nobody, the my country right or wrong is kind of a parody of a certain kind of person, but I don't think there are very many people who would actually sign on to that.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of people who just can't see when their country's wrong.
So let me, I guess one thing, and it kind of relates to your previous work, because this is also something I've been thinking about quite a bit lately, and I haven't had the opportunity to vent it or like to explore it. But one of the reasons why I think it's important to have narrow definitions for language is because if you have some idea, so like language is some kind of space that you can use you're mapping some idea that you have onto some framework. And language is the way that you make them out. Like, I have this idea, I want to express that idea. And so I'm writing down a description basically of how to get that in this large universe that we live in. And the more precisely I can articulate my thoughts, meaning that the more narrowly tuned my language becomes, the more precisely I can take that thought, put it onto paper, and convey that thought to somebody else. And a danger of having terms that are fluffy, like word salad type stuff, is that you can just kind of like throw spaghetti at something and hope that people kind of get the idea of what's happening, hope that something sticks, instead of kind of using the language to articulate a very specific thought. You kind of convey a general a general feeling in some particular area, or a general thought, and it loses a lot of its impact because you're losing a lot of the insight that you might gain by having the focus, or what's the right way to, like, the resolution that you get from narrow language.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree that that's a problem. You want people to use precise language and not equivocate on terms. I do wonder, though, whether like the emphasis on precision can be overemphasized. Like,
I mean, there's no doubt that it can be, right? It kind of depends on your audience.
Yeah. Like, there's a limit. Like, I think sometimes it comes up in like philosophical arguments. Someone will demand that you define a term that just seems intuitively basic. Like, well, what do you mean by meaning?
Uh-huh.
And
what is the definition of the word is?
Yeah, that kind of thing, where I think the demand for further precision and further specification there seems something sneaky about it. Like, but
so a little bit of precision is good. Infinity might not be good.
No, a lot of precision is good, but still, like within limits. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So when it comes to patriotism, what position have you thought about? What position you're going to take? Or are you still going to be thinking your way through it?
I'm going to be thinking my way through it. I think it's called Why It's Okay to Be Patriotic. So if I come to the conclusion that it's just totally a bad thing, that's going to cause some complications, I suppose.
It goes against the grain of what the book was.
Yeah. I mean, this is the thing. I mean, you agree to write a book with a certain title, but you also want to investigate it with an open mind, which means I should in principle be open to arriving at the conclusion that patriotism is terrible.
Uh-huh.
So you can see the dilemma there. But I don't think I'm likely to change my mind about this. I do think that it's important for human beings to belong to, like,
greater structures.
Greater structures, yeah, things bigger than themselves, like communities that extend beyond their immediate kin and that kind of thing. And I think that has virtuous modes and it has vicious modes. And I think there is one thing I'm very confident in is that there is among a lot of intellectuals this kind of anti-patriotism that it's sophisticated to denigrate your own country and to do the opposite of what the extreme nationalists do, and always cast your country's actions in like the worst possible light, like instinctively.
So, and as a consequence, you're basically letting the opposition dictate what you think, because you have to think the opposite of what they're saying, and therefore they still get to dictate the terms.
That's one possible consequence. Yeah, I mean that's one bad thing. But I remember I was at this teaching workshop several years ago. And the grad students I was the only philosopher there. There were some English students and some education people. And there was a writing assignment where we were given a page of a textbook, it's a children's encyclopedia from like Argentina from the year 2000. And it was like incredibly bland. I couldn't read the Spanish, but they were just pictures. And we were supposed to write one sentence that represents America based on those pictures.
Mm-hmm.
And these were the pictures. A picture of the World Trade Center, still standing in the year 2000. A picture of the Grand Canyon. A picture of the Golden Gate Bridge. A kid in a like dressed up like a cowboy with cap guns, like a little kid, like a 4-year-old maybe, and some people playing football. And I think those were the only pictures. And so come up with a picture of America based on those pictures, like in a sentence. And one of the other groups came up with the sentence, America is obsessed with power and domination. And I just thought,
how did you get that?
Are they looking at the same pictures I was? And I looked, and they were, and I like, how do you figure? And they said, oh, the little kid with the cap guns is like very threatening. I'm like, are you joking? And it's just sort of obvious that you could, give a Rorschach test to these people, and every single ink blob would look like patriarchy and white supremacy. It's so I just think there's definitely a bad current there of like this instinctive see the worst, say the worst about your own country, because that's sophisticated. It's like taking the idea that criticism is the highest form of patriotism, and it's like, well, no, I mean, criticism of a loved one isn't necessarily the highest expression of love. Sometimes you criticize, sometimes you really shouldn't. And I think that's true on level of large collectives as well as with more intimate relationships.
So let me, one of the things that I've grown to appreciate over the last, I don't know, probably 15 years, is the role that kind of knowing your roots, like knowing where your family's from. So there was a newspaper article, a New York Times article that came out in, I think it was like 2004. And there was a study from a group of people. They had been looking at, children's well-being in terms of like how comfortable they are, and I guess they had a bunch of psychological measures, and they were, how well did they handle stress was part of it. And they did this study, and it showed that, I'll share the article with you when we're done. And it basically said that it appeared as though the children who felt like they were part of a larger narrative handled stress better. So like they knew who their parents were, like where their parents were born. They knew who their grandparents were. They knew how their parents met, those kinds of family stories. That they did better at handling stress. And then the study originally finished in like 2000, and then September 11th happened, and the researchers went back to the same families to see how are they dealing with the new stress that came along with the September 11th attacks. And they found the same thing, that the children who kind of were more, knew more about where they fit into their own family history, did better at dealing with the stress. Like they were less anxious about things. And a number of things came out. One of them was that when the family narrative was, it didn't correlate so much with, if the family narrative was always rising, like my grandfather was a farmer, or like was a vagrant, and then my father was a farmer, and now I'm an engineer, and you're going to be, the president of the world. That kind of family narrative didn't actually contribute as much, was not as favorable.
Yeah.
Neither was one that was always in decline, where, we used to be the richest family in the world, and now we're, just scraping by. But rather the ups and the downs, like the reality of, we've had good times and we've had bad times, that kind of understanding that helped kids navigate through the kind of complexities that happened after September 11th. And that was something that I guess the Army even adopted some of this stuff, where they started doing like unit cohesion. Like, here's the history of this regiment, or here's the history of this battalion. We fought in this place, and we fought in, this is the history where we came from, and these are the great people that came out of our unit. Was a means of kind of bringing the unit together that they had at least been experimenting with. I think you were in the military, weren't you? Maybe.
Yeah.
That, but.
Yeah, and I agree with the general lesson here. I think it's true that, like, in large individualistic societies, it's the danger is going to be a loss of a sense of belonging. How do you have a society with a lot of individual freedom with also a lot of sort of communal feeling? And I think this is a major problem facing Western societies. But I have to say,
like Seattle.
my time is just about run out, and I've got an appointment I've got to make here pretty soon.
Okay, no problem. So, do you have any final thoughts that you want to bring? Oh, so let me just make my statement, and then you can maybe
Sure.
at some point in the future we could explore it again if you're up for it. Would be one of the things about patriotism. Like, I love my country. I love the United States, and part of that is because this is where my family comes from. Like, where my family's been for, in some cases, 400 years. In other cases, 100 years. But my own history is kind of connected to the other states in the Union and other people that I interact with in the country, because that's where my heritage is, and it's shaped kind of my perceptions of things and my reality. And so I have no problem expressing, love and loyalty to the place where I'm from, because it's where I'm from. So that's part of my thoughts about it.
I'd say there's something virtuous in that, but you'll have to wait a while to see my total case for that.
If it holds up under scrutiny.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Go ahead, and you have the last word. You might as well go ahead and restate who you are and how people can find you.
Oh yeah, Spencer Case. You can find me at spencercasephilosophy.com. My podcast is Microdigressions. Last point is, you were saying that I think you did in fact say earlier in our conversation that things got less certain when you were stepping outside of science. I would cavil with that somewhat. When you're stepping beyond that which is empirically verifiable, I think at least some of the things I believe that I'm most confident of may not be empirically verifiable, probably aren't. The wrongness of certain categories of actions, that I was the same person in some metaphysical sense that I was yesterday, I feel pretty confident of. So I still think, despite the provisos you gave earlier, that you might be seeing science in a more normative light than I would see it, where to call something scientific is a term of praise, maybe. But I think it's been a really interesting conversation, and there are a lot of threads that we could take up again sometime.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you. I really appreciate your time, and thanks for coming on. And I'll be in touch if something, as you develop, your work on these books. Then I'm interested to see kind of how that plays out. And thanks again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for the invitation. It's been fun.
All right. We'll see you later.
Okay. Goodbye.